All right, as we go through myth making in this section, we concentrate more on coming out of the doctrine of discovery after the whole mythology of Columbus's so-called discovery of what becomes a new world. Again, the right to define. We have many times the story of the United States starts with the talk about the so-called what we call the Pilgrims. And in this story, we ask the question, well, why is the mythology of pilgrimism so important? And we have to first of all realize that although we've been told a particular story, let's go back to the slide earlier about how the pilgrims came from to seek what is the mythology, right? Their oppression because of the religious freedom that they want to practice in a particular way. Therefore, they move around Europe and are forced to migrate, to immigrate to what was then called New England as part of the colonies. And the mythology, of course, they come upon the Mayflower, create the Mayflower Compact. Uh, you know, Religiously persecuted, so they have to find a way, and they struggle against the so-called wilderness to bring civilization to this land. The promise of providence, the promise of these lands being set aside for them. And so they come across in this mythology, right, the land at so-called Plymouth Rock. And for most people, well, let me ask you, what do you think is the first thing that they did when they landed at Plymouth Rock? And the question we should ask ourselves is how come none of this is really taught in the schools, even at the university level? And what is the purpose of that mythology? And in fact, most people don't realize the first place they come upon and land was a huge sand berm area near the shoreline. And they come up on the beach. First thing they do, of course, they do a prayer. And then they're part of the prayer and the blessings, they realize that they just came upon a huge mound, a sand dune, and they give thanks to the fact that it's a sand dune of burials of American Indians who had passed away about 20, 25 years earlier, when earlier settlements were there that brought diseases to those lands, and whereby I'm assuming thousands of American Indians died, and therefore were buried in these sand dunes. And so the so-called pilgrims, or all saints were called back then, celebrate this idea and thank God for giving them the that particular spot to land on, with the idea that the first thing that they did, in fact, people don't realize the first thing they did was to grave rob, yeah, to dig up those graves and to secure items and trinkets and jewels and so forth that they found, as if a sign from God that this was left for them, that the land would be vanquished for them. And so the mythology of the pilgrims, of course, gives us this idea that they came by and the Indians welcomed them, and they, like you might have seen the Disney version of Squanto. Again, the mythology is that somehow that they arrived and the Indians were in a friendly manner, helped them out and survived, and that's part of the story. What's missing, of course, is that the pilgrims do arrive, and during that first so-called winter, it's such a hard winter for them, as many of them had never been farmers, have never lived off the land. And these merchants and people who had no background in farming, virtually 50% of them die that first winter. And in order to survive, see, many people don't realize, in order to survive, they weren't eating pumpkin pie, turkey, and corn and all that good stuff. In fact, of course, they had to eat each other. Cannibalism was practiced by the pilgrims for that first winter. And again, this is a fact. Why isn't that story told? Of course. And as the story goes, the natives of that area, people like the Pequot, Winnebagos, and others who were so, in their humanity, were so saddened that these people were starving and dying, uh, came in and showed them and taught them the ways of how to live off the land, how to plant, how to fish, how to catch seafood, and celebration and so forth. And the mythology, of course, of this somehow sense of beloved friendship, again, is a way to mask this colonial settlerism that comes from Europe. And really, when you look at the history, none of what I just told you was true. Yeah, again, they weren't eating pumpkin pie and turkey, and that the American Indians really helped to provide the means to survive. Well, unfortunately, 20 years later, 25 years later, we have things like the Mystic Massacre and the Pequot War, where the descendants and even some of the original so-called pilgrims massacred the same natives that helped them to survive. And it kind of reminds me of a lot of the stuff that's going on in the world today. So in 1637, they launched attack on the Pequot village. I mean, these are the people of that land who are attacked by these settlers, where they burnt and burnt. They had something about fire. Where they like to burn the homes, and in the idea of scorching the earth of the heathens and savages. And as much as 600 to 700, as the story goes, were killed by the so-called in the so-called Mystic Massacre. And you can read, some of the language that describes how they would surround using fire and kill women and children, the old and the sick, and would tie this into this mythology. Again, it's political mythology. Somehow this was not just sanctioned by so-called God, but this is something that God wanted them to do. I mean, you got to think about that kind of religious dogma, that kind of religious supremacy that is encoded in its kind of actions. And as the quote goes, of the inhabitants remaining were largely Pequot women and children and older men. Mason ordered that the enclosure be set on fire. Justifying his conduct later, Mason declared the attack against the Pequot was an act of a god who laughed his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making as a fiery oven. Again, these were the same people that had helped them to survive, yet, one generation later, the mentality was in fact to erase them from the earth through fire. Thus did the Lord judge amongst the heathen, filling with dead bodies. Mason insisted that any Pequot attempt to escape the flames should be killed. So this is what my point is to understand. These are the pilgrims. These are the pilgrims that are celebrated every year with the ideas of Thanksgiving. And in particular to Thanksgiving, we need to look at the words of William Bradford, one of the first governors of these lands. Um, and as he says, again, his first Thanksgiving proclamation in 1637. The first Thanksgiving was tied to what's called the Pequot Massacre. I mean, think about it. When people today talk about Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims, you're really celebrating the Pequot Massacre. Those that scrape at the fire were slain with the sword, some hewed to pieces, others run through with the rapiers, so as they were to quickly dispatch, and very few escape it. It was conceived that they thus destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same, and the horrible was the stink and the scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice as they gave the prayers, therefore, to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, thus to enclose their enemies in their hands and give them so speedy a victory over so proud and insulting an enemy. Anyway, but again, to tie in, when we think about Thanksgiving, the mythology of Thanksgiving, and I was talking about my own self, a little boy, a young boy, we would take us to school, half the class would dress up as Indians, one class, half would dress as Thanksgiving, do the whole Thanksgiving pantry, we'd all come together and share and march around the school in our uniforms, eat pumpkin pie and corn and turkey and celebrate this loving brotherhood, when in reality, none of that was true. And we must ask our question, why is therefore the story told? Even in the education, why the mythology? What service does the mythology share? Who does it empower and who does it disempower? And so this is the point. Thanksgiving, which becomes a holiday, is based on a myth that is made to seem as if historical fact, when in fact it wasn't historical fact. It's actually very horrific that what had occurred. And again, the question is, if history is about telling the truth, why is none of this taught in schools? Why, in fact, is the mythology taught? And I just want to continue with some other American mythologies, just to kind of showcase how mythologies become ways in which we take for historical fact, and they help to shape and guide the way we think about history. And again, history has a purpose. History has a purpose. It serves a purpose. Well, George Washington, right, talked about as the father of America, as the father of that country. Well, and his people don't realize he was the most wealthiest person of his time. He had 317 slaves when he died. 317. Um, and in fact, one of the slaves, Billy Lee, that you see in the photograph there, was freed upon his death. And you got to remember now, he could have freed all of his slaves, but he didn't. He's also important to understand that, not just as a slave owner, but he was a very wealthy slave owner. And he began much of the policies and verbiage and rhetoric about about erasing ethnic cleansing of the land and language of extermination and policies, especially military policies, scorched earth policies, come from George Washington. Instructions to attack Iroquois people, lay waste all the settlements around that the country may not be merely overrun but destroyed. And part of their tactic was not just to kill the people, but to destroy and burn and eradicate all of the land, all of the naturalness of the land, right? So that the so-called native peoples could no longer survive upon the land. And you can see this policy, which George Washington is really um, um, helps to develop and institutes as part of the United States, becomes part of the process of the extermination of American Indians right across the continent. So you cannot look at George Washington without also thinking about his role in perpetuation of slavery and also his role in the development of the extermination. And I use the word extermination not as hyperbole rhetoric, but as you're going to see, these are words that were used by them, their own words, to describe what they were doing at that time. Now, Thomas Jefferson, right, he's the second president of the United States, the great so called writer. He's the one who creates the verbiage, which becomes part of the U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Rights, and so forth. You know, a man of powerful words during his time. But he was also one of the most wealthiest slave owners out of Virginia. He had over 200 slaves. And unfortunately, when he died, he only freed five. Think about that. And in fact, he makes an interesting quote. He writes about how the horrors of slavery and how bad it is, but he also says how important it is to keep his wealth. As he says, quote, don't do it. Keep your slaves, be a good master. So when he says words like all men are created equal, must remember his words, all men are created equal, does not include American Indians, blacks, and others non-white peoples. Quote, this unfortunate difference of color and perhaps of faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Some of you might be familiar with his story. As you can see in the bottom left here, him and his famous slave named Sally Hemings, you know, who was a Hopper half-breed slave who was his concubine, his actual own slave, that he started to rape from when she was a young girl of 12 years old. And he actually had children with her. And you can see in the what's this show? I forget the name of that show anyway. But you know, they poke fun at the fact of his actual descendants, that he had actually had slave descendants. I want you to think about that. You know, and so the great so-called emancipator also had a huge role in development the mentality of the erasure and the ethnic cleansing and the genocide of American Indians, as he says here. The Indian resistance must be met with the hatchet. Jefferson continued, and if ever we are constrained to lift the hatchet against any tribe, in other words, whenever you're going to stop us from murdering, yeah, he wrote, we will never lay it down till the tribe is exterminated. Again, listen to that. He's not saying move the people. He's saying what? To exterminate the whole tribe. This is how he saw other human beings, the non-whites. Right? I mean, think about the language extermination. Who reminds you? Who else used that kind of words of extermination? Yeah, perhaps, yeah. If you think about World War II and the Nazis, yeah, that's right, Adolf Hitler. Those kinds of policies of extermination. Or is driven beyond the Mississippi. In war, they will kill some of us. We will destroy all of them. Pursue the Indians to extermination. Again, that language of extermination. So when we think about President Thomas Jefferson, it's unfortunate a lot of people don't know his actual words. Yes, I guess he was a great writer in regards to the development of American republicanism, the Declaration of Independence and such, the Constitution. But that always has to be in the context of what kind of person he was. Not just a very, very wealthy slave owner, but also one that talked about the exterminating of other human beings. We can look at other important icons of of American history, yeah, people like President Abraham Lincoln, and a lot of people talk about why Lincoln is the hero is because he was for equality and he was against slavery. Let's kind of look a little bit about his history. Yes, he was involved, and yes, he did make some changes politically, eventually as a president. But it's real clear that he never ever saw the so-called black person as an equal. Yeah, he never was a proponent of equality. And in fact, the whole mythology, again, the mythology that the so-called American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was fought over slavery. No, it was fought really over the rights of states. Yeah, slavery, in fact, was one of the questions involved, but they did not go to war because of slavery. They went to war because the South refused, of course, to allow the North. And he has a lot of political, economic, and other social issues. But again, let's look at his own words. Let's look at this is Abraham Lincoln's words in 1862, as he says, quote at the top. If I could save the Union, in other words, this war, if I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. I mean, you listen to it again. Say this again. If I could save the Union, in other words, stop the war, without freeing any slave, I would do it. In other words, his intention wasn't to free the slaves. His intention was what? To keep the Union. Yeah. The end of slavery became an event during the war when, in fact, the North, the Union Army needed more so-called soldiers to be involved, and of course, North um, uh, ex-slaves and what was termed back then Negroes were then incorporated to be part of the faction that would then go to war with the South. Yeah. Also, as he says here, just to be quote, this is his own words. Again, I will say then, I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. That I am not, nor have ever been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes. So let's be clear. He was not talking about making them citizens, full citizens of the United States, and he definitely was not looking at them as being equal. That's his own words. Not Kaleko's words, that's all his words. He also at one time said, well, to free the slaves and actually send them back to Africa, which is to send them to Liberia, I should say. Another important factor, a lot of people don't realize that the largest mass execution hanging in the United States was under the direction of Abraham Lincoln when he ordered the mass hanging of Dakota. And I think it was in a Minnesota territory at that time. 38 of them who were hung, all innocent, who had nothing to do with some incidences, wars at that time between some settlers and some other American Indians, but they needed somebody to punish. And so they hung 38 Dakotas to pay for the price of those other. Again, this is part of who Lincoln was. Now, as I said, don't get mad at the messenger. If you get angry at his own words. This is not myself. The question I ask is why none of this is told? Why the mythology to make Abraham Lincoln appear to be something that, in fact, obviously he was not? What's the purpose? Who does it support? Who does it negate? The horrors of slavery. People talk about slavery as if it's kind of just was free labor, and it's kind of like they were lucky. I hear people say, that they were lucky to have been taken and enslaved to become so-called Americans. And slavery was horrific. The transatlantic slave trade, depending on the numbers, you're talking about tens of millions of Africans who were physically stolen, kidnapped out of their homeland, brought over the seas by the thousands upon ships where hundreds would be loaded like cheap cargo, where many would die over that what's called the passage. Yeah, and if they survived, of course, the process of the dehumanization to make them into a slave was horrific. In fact, cost many their lives. And again, for humans to become beasts of burdens for others, to be owned like beasts, like chattel slavery, really was something new of this kind at this point. And you can see through history, again, look at this image of this guy's scarred back, that kind of punishment. You can look, I mean, it's some of the worst forms of punishment, and I don't have time to go through everything, but we must remember when people try to portray slavery as if it's just a kind of like footnote to history. No, it was the most important economic engine generator for these plantation owners, yeah, where they use these bodies, and the bodies themselves were commodified and used to be sold on the market. But we must always remember there was also resistance to this slavery. From the very beginning, from the every capture, they would resist. And in fact, there are many, many stories you can find. Again, why aren't these stories more known of those who rebelled and resisted so-called slavery? And in fact, you can read about the Haitian Revolution and others. Nat Turner is someone you guys should read about, and probably there's a movie about his life also with Nat Turner. as the story goes, at one time had worked as a preacher on behalf of the slave owners to preach to so-called slaves why being a slave was their duty in life, to accept their duty in life in a religious uh, message. And eventually, in that turn, the story goes, God spoke to him and says, "Kill your master. You should never allow yourself to be treated this way." And he led rebellions in which many, many slave owners were then killed and slaves freed themselves. He was eventually captured. Now, you want to hear a funny, weird, sick story? When his body was captured, how's this? It was cooked and then it was eaten. I'm not lying. Go and check yourself. Don't you don't believe Kalekwa? Go look up the body of Nat Turner and his body being eaten. Uh, I mean, I don't understand it, but that's all part of that history. Another important part is you must remember the resistance to slavery. There were important so-called white European peoples also. John Brown, in fact, if you know the story of John Brown, as you can see in the top left here, John Brown was a white man. John Brown was a Christian. John Brown believed in his Christian religion that it was an evil, slavery was an evil form, from the devil himself. And so he led himself, along with family members, resistance to slavery, where they took up arms. John Brown helped to take up arms against slave owners to free slaves. But I think that's, again, an important story that we all should understand. Yes, there are so called good white Christian people who didn't just speak out, and there are many who actually spoke on behalf, like John Adams and others, but those who actually picked up arms to free slaves, like John Brown. So this would also give that kind of perspective that, yeah, color is not simply good and bad, and in fact you have people that even with the privilege of not being enslaved because of the color still gave up their lives for the freedom of others. Now, this mentality of manifest destiny is at the heart of American empire, and this is in fact what comes into Hawaii and then later comes into the rest of the Pacific. John Sullivan, through his writings, and in fact, has a quote, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which providence has given us." Again, the idea that God had granted all of these lands through their religious dogma, the right to ethnic cleanse this land, to remove the people off of those lands, and to establish this idea of manifest destiny. In other words, it's the destiny of God for them to take these lands through violence and force, and this is what they did. And so began through the 1800s. I mean, literally the ethnic cleansing, physical removal of the native peoples off of those lands, whether by disease, purposely spreading disease through things like blankets, like General Amherst, through campaigns when they would destroy, an example you might be all know, when they killed all the buffalo off of the land to destroy the food supply for the plain so-called Indians, and so forth. Not including, of course, so-called settlers with guns and ammos and the trains that would be used to annihilate and eradicate the native peoples onward to west. And so this idea of moving west, go west, it's God's plan, manifest destiny, erasing the native becomes part of the American psyche. It's as if it is granted by God Himself, and this is with a mentality of manifest destiny. And think about what's going on in the world today. Yeah, that idea that in your culture, in your philosophy, that God told you that's your right to do upon those that your God supposedly believes as being less than human beings. And manifest destiny, again, you can look at many of the images, the stories that you saw shape the mentality and the ideology of Americanism. I mean, even to this modern day, if you watch one of the series that's connected with Yellowstone, the famous show, I think it's 1883, really talks about shows the move, the so-called settlers moving across with covered wagons, the plains, and making their way to go west. This image, this philosophy, this narrative, as we say, of seeking freedom and bringing civilization and vanquishing the savages and bringing civilization to the land is all part of that American myth making story that is sold. And again, look at the images from the paintings themselves. Yeah. I mean, I talked about Amherst earlier. Again, just to say, this is an example of biological warfare is not something new. That this is in fact was performed on American Indians. The natives themselves were given blankets, loused with smallpox, knowingly, in fact, purposely done with the idea that it would eradicate and kill off the natives. Yeah. Massacres of American Indians is as red, white, and blue, and apple pie, and Chevrolet, and the whole kind of language of as American as can be. It's part of American history. Yeah, the massacre of Native peoples, and you can see the massacres went on, and these are just some of the more famous so-called massacres. And lastly, not it went all the way to 1890. I want to be clear, 1890. Yeah, with Wounded Knee, and where the old who were sick, women and children who were there gathered, and the last resistance, last free so-called Sioux or Lakota, are a Wounded Knee. Um, the Americans cavalry showed up with Gatling guns and cannons and fired upon people who, for the most part, were unarmed and killed them off, and then built these large mass graves where they would toss these bodies, and it took all these photographs. In fact, some of them received accommodations from the military for their so-called job of, I mean, just murdering women, children, and the old. And you can see, if you look at these images here, it should remind you of the same kind of images you can think of what happens in World War II with the Nazis when they occupied, this idea of how the United States is formed, as if when people talk about liberty and freedom for all, we must remember genocide is an important cornerstone of Manifest Destiny. Things like the Trail of Tears from 1830, and you can see where thousands of so-called native peoples were marched across the United States from far away, especially like Florida, will be marched across all the way to what becomes the Oklahoma territories. Ethnic cleansing didn't start in World War II. The American Empire was founded on ethnic cleansing. Yeah, and again, even in fact, legalized in their law from the 1830 Indian Removal Act. Yeah, so think about it, it was legal upon American law to do what they did. And so the Trail of Tears, probably one of the most horrific stories where, you know, forcibly marched across in the cold where many, many died and perished, never again to return to their homelands. And so, as even the words of David Stannard reminds us that, from the time of Columbus for over 400 years, when you look at what happens to the so-called, what he calls in his book called American Holocaust, again, Oxford Press, this isn't a, you know, brother uncle's, something he published on Amazon. We're talking Oxford. So this is something that's been researched, has been challenged, and is an academic explanation. So when he talks about 100 million, I repeat, 100 million American Indians since the time of Columbus, it's not a wild assertion. And in fact, this is backed by actual information. Yeah, and he's a professor of American Studies himself. Yeah. And then the process moved into a forced assimilation, the idea that you had to forcibly change now American Indians to educational policies and coercive assimilation now. So you physically destroyed it from the outside. Now they're going to destroy them from the inside out. And so the schools were developed really to transform and change these American Indians, yeah, to become good, civilized, so-called savages. And we see the legitimization of these through political myths, and of course, the question is, how does these myths connect and affect Hawaii? I'm going to end there. Aloha nui.